Hello, News with Sue's live emergency podcast. We have a guest today. Well, actually, I'm the guest, and this guy is going to interview me. And this guy is my husband,
Breaking
Jamie
news.
Agnes. Breaking news for those of you who didn't know.
Okay, let's jump straight into this. So this is an emergency broadcast following an incredibly busy day of international diplomacy. We'll talk a bit both about the events that have just happened in Sharm el-Sheikh, which is mainly about Arabic leaders, but also first about what happened in the Knesset, which is very much targeted at a domestic Israeli audience and, of course, the world at large. But before we get to any of that, just give a reflection about Trump's general demeanor. It really struck me, his comments on the plane and just the way he was talking during the course of the day, that even he has been struck by the sort of magnitude of the moment in a way that you don't often see with President Trump.
Yeah, so this speech was over an hour long. I watched it so that you don't have to. And on his way over, so when I first woke up this morning, there was a clip going viral because on his way over on Air Force One, President Trump was asked about whether or not he thought he would go to heaven. And he basically said no. He said he doesn't think that he would make it to heaven, and this is probably as close as he's going to get, aka Air Force One. But he also said that he's done a lot of good things for the world and for people, and people's lives are better because of it. So I think he was already sort of in this reflective mode on his way to the Holy Land to address Israeli parliament in Jerusalem. Reminder that actually his administration was the one who moved the Israeli capital to Jerusalem, which was quite controversial, given the debate around Israel and Jerusalem being the center of the, three big monotheistic religions. Anyway, so in the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament, which is usually quite rambunctious, one would say, there was a really humbling tone, and he kind of, when they were praising him, so like the Israeli leaders came up and said that the world needs to have more Trumps, and about the Nobel Peace Prize, quite a few of them said that other prize, you're gonna get it, it's only a matter of time, and so I was really struck by his demeanor. I mean, he visibly seemed like he was in a state of humility, which is not something that you normally would associate Donald Trump with.
I think, like, whatever you think about how he got to this point, and whatever you think about the ceasefire agreement generally and about Trump in person, it is just a really big moment, isn't it? It's just one of those really big days in global affairs, and there was that sense of it watching it.
Yeah, definitely, and I think he recognized that as well. But at the same time, one of the reasons why they were able to reach this deal of kind of a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel was because of the Abraham Accords, because of the massive achievement in 2020 where the Trump administration brought about a number of Arab countries recognizing Israel and working with Israel, and he actually nodded to that today. He said that, the Arab countries didn't leave the Abraham Accords throughout the war because, he mentioned loyalty, which he's really big on, but also he said they didn't leave because they've made a lot of money off of the Abraham Accords, and he nodded to Jared and said, Jared, like, bring more countries
this is Jared
in.
Kushner.
Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, who brought the Abraham Accords to fruition in 2020 in the first place. But he told Jared to bring more countries in and, no games, aka Saudi Arabia, which, you needed. The reason why we were able to get to this point is because we needed all these kind of Gulf states to come on board, and also Qatar to put pressure on Hamas to, sign, to actually agree to a ceasefire.
The other person he referenced during his remarks in the Knesset was his Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff. Just remind everyone a bit about this guy. What character is he? What's his background?
Yeah, so Steve Witkoff was an interesting one when he was picked to be the Middle East envoy because he's a real estate guy. He's just one of Trump's buddies. And critics said that he doesn't have experience. What's he going to be able to do? But, in this speech today, Trump talked about a meeting that Witkoff had with Putin, because obviously ending the Ukraine war is a big one, a big feather in the cap for Trump that he's chasing after. And he mentioned that Witkoff had this very long meeting with Putin and joked that it just was never ending. So around hour 4, they heard that it was kind of wrapping up. It wasn't until hour 5 till when it actually did wrap up. And he said, what were you guys talking about? And basically he says that Witkoff is a really good diplomat because he thinks he's a really good guy.
So Witkoff did diplomacy for the Russia-Ukraine discussions as well as the Middle East. So he comes to occupy a really important role alongside Marco Rubio, Secretary of State.
And so in the speech, he nodded to both Jared and Witkoff again and said, we're gonna get a deal with Iran, but we need to deal with Russia first. And so he already pivoted to the wider region to kind of bring peace with Iran, because Israel and Iran are technically still at war. I mean, there is a ceasefire, but they're technically still at war. And so he was saying things like, the Iranians, I'm not worried about the Iranians having a nuclear weapon, rather. They just want to survive, and Iranians are good people and they're hardworking and this, that, and the other.
So just talk about the kind of feel and the language of the remarks in the Knesset. Obviously, he's talking to the Israeli parliament, and it struck me that he was really couching a lot of his language in the kind of history of the state of Israel, the history of the Jewish people, almost not exactly religious language, but language which reflected how Israel got to where it got to today. It also struck me that Trump was reading quite a bit from a teleprompter, from a prepared script, which often he just completely improvises these lengthy kind of campaign-style speeches. But perhaps in a nod to the formality of the occasion, he actually delivered most of a prepared script as well as some clearly improvised sections of the speech.
So at the beginning, the leader of the Knesset said, "Oh, don't worry, Mr. President, your teleprompter is working. Our team has made sure, because of the whole debacle in the UN when the teleprompter apparently wasn't working." But yeah, he didn't really go off script. And the few times that he did go off script, he actually called himself out on it, including a time where he turned to the Israeli president and asked him to pardon Netanyahu, who is obviously facing corruption charges internally and, as other issues on the global stage.
We should pick up that point, because I think for the rest of the world looking inwards, the position of Benjamin Netanyahu is, he is currently under indictment by the ICC. Actually, before the war started, his own internal political position in Israel was rather precarious. But you don't get any sense of that listening to Trump speaking to the Knesset. He was very full of praise for Netanyahu, even though I think we know that behind the scenes over the last month or two, there's been real friction between President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu in an attempt to get this over the line. So say a bit more about that.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think the rest of the world is watching this and maybe not feeling the same sort of jubilance that is happening inside Israel and inside, Trump's world, so to speak. Like, obviously, the devastation that's happened with the Palestinians and the protests that have ensued around the world, including here in England, that's not gonna, like, people aren't gonna forget. Like, what was missing from the speech was, how are we gonna rebuild? How are you actually gonna demilitarize Hamas? How are we gonna make sure this doesn't happen again? Like, how do we make sure peace is sustainable? Like, none of that was mentioned. It was a lot of, it was like you say, it was like very religious and all about kind of the state of Israel. In fact, Miriam Edelson was there, and he kind of made a joke about how he was like, "Oh, I'm going to get her in trouble by saying this," and talked about how she was in his office one time, and Miriam Edelson is a very wealthy Israeli American billionaire. Her and her husband were big donors of Trump. And he said, "Who do you love more, Israel or the United States of America?" And he said she refused to respond. And so, he also mentioned that his daughter converted to Judaism to marry Jared Kushner, who loves Israel. And then he joked that he didn't know that was going to happen and that, they're very happy. But
so we'll come to the really important Arab world perspective in a minute when we move to Sharm el-Sheikh, as it were. But just worth pausing on, of course, the other backdrop to all of this was an incredibly important moment when the remaining hostages held in Gaza, both dead and alive, those hostages were released and handed over. And I think that probably helps explain the kind of the emotional intensity of the Knesset and the kind of emotional intensity of the day in Israel.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, listen, like today is about the hostages being released, and today is October 8th, is what I keep seeing around social media. So today the focus is on.
Wait, it's October the 13th.
No, but it's October the 13th, but we keep saying that like, oh, it's finally October 8th,
yeah, okay,
right?
Got it,
so it's fine. So like since October 7th, 2023, it's been October 7th for Israelis and widely for the Jewish population. And so many people who are celebrating the end of this war are saying that today is October 8th. And so I think tomorrow the conversation will be moving on to the aftermath and the devastation left in Gaza and rebuilding and what happens to the people who are returning to no homes. I mean, Ahmed in Gaza, who I've been in touch with since October 2023, he has returned to no home. And so I asked him, I said, oh my gosh, like, how are you feeling? Finally, the war's over, the bombing's stopping. And, he didn't have like he's like, I'm too tired and broke and homeless to celebrate.
Yeah, I mean, people talk about a day of mixed emotions. It's such a cliche, and it doesn't even begin to cover what both Arab audiences and Israeli audiences are feeling today. Just an extraordinary day of immense highs and lows for everyone right across the region. Let's move a bit then. As Trump moved geographically from this moment at the Knesset, he then flew very late. Apparently the schedule's 2.5, 3 hours late. We've just been watching some of it on the television before coming on live here. He's moved to Sharm el-Sheikh for what is more of a kind of Arab world summit. So he's being hosted by President Sisi of Egypt and Sharm el-Sheikh. Other European leaders, I think, including President Macron and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, are in attendance. And there was a sort of a more brief, but not that brief, set of remarks from President Trump in Sharm el-Sheikh before they went into kind of a series of bilaterals. And I guess in those remarks, he's starting to pick up on some of those other issues that you've mentioned, which is that this is only the end of the beginning, not the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning. There needs to be significant progress now on first kind of keeping the peace in place, and all Arab nations will need to play a part in that. And then, of course, this massive set of issues around reconstruction in Gaza.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think that the Arab world is going to have a bit of a reckoning when it comes to the reconstruction, because they're going to have to get involved. And there has been criticism that they haven't been as involved as they could have been throughout the war while a humanitarian crisis has unfolded.
But would it be fair to say, it seems to me, our experience of living in the region, it seems to me that a lot of Arab nations haven't really wanted to start discussing reconstruction until a ceasefire or even a permanent end to the war is in place, because in their eyes it seems to it would legitimize Israel's military campaign in Gaza to sort of start thinking about the day after the conflict. Now that at the very least there is a ceasefire and hopefully in time a full peace settlement, do you think then that Arab states give themselves some permission to start to talk about these incredibly important issues about how to rebuild with political and civil stability, particularly for the civilian population?
I mean, I think yes, but I also think that's there's a reason why Trump noted to the widening of the Abraham Accords in the speech, not like nod Saudi Arabia, because they want Saudi Arabia to be involved. Saudi Arabia needs to be involved, but Saudi Arabia is also not going to join the Abraham Accords without a Palestinian state. Like, there's no way in which I see how that could possibly happen. I mean, maybe they find a way to word it differently, but there needs to be a sort of sense of sovereignty for the Palestinians before the Saudis join the Abraham Accords.
So, but in that sense, do the steps taken by the UK, for example, to recognise a Palestinian state in recent weeks, that is why those steps are diplomatically significant, right? Because there needs to be, however much that is opposed, certainly by the United States and by Israel, there needs to be a sense of progress towards something that looks and feels a bit like a Palestinian state in order for Arab countries to remain on board with this process. Would that be a fair
Yeah,
summary?
I think that is fair. I mean, like, technically, isn't the reason why they actually recognized a Palestinian state was because of refugee status, right? Isn't
Right.
That's so there was more like logistical reasons for that as much as symbolic.
Let's talk a bit about Trump's sense of a wider peace in the region, which still has sort of significant tensions roiling across it. He mentioned, I think, both in the Knesset and at Sharm el-Sheikh, he talked about Iran. And obviously the Iran-Israel conflict is still a live conflict. And it was only a few weeks ago, of course, that Israel attacked a target in Qatar itself. So there is still a wider conflict. Trump is holding out still the possibility of some kind of longer term settlement with Iran, which feels pretty distant, feels a bit of a stretch, right? But what did you make of what he said today?
I mean, it feels like a stretch. It also feels like it's the same exact deal that already existed with Obama and then he pulled out of. So, I mean, is he going to negotiate a deal with the Islamic Republic of Iran and the regime?
Well, he hasn't ruled that out. Like his language seems to leave the door open to that, because Trump just likes to talk about making a deal, and he will talk about making a deal with Iran, however impossible that seems. He's still at least talking about it.
Sounds like North Korea. How did that go down?
Yeah, no, of course. But I think it's interesting that not only does he recognise that the tensions posed by Iran's political activity sponsoring, violent terrorist groups outside its own borders, he recognises that that's an issue, and it's an issue that he still wants to do something about, right?
Yeah, our phone's ringing.
It's an authentic live.
Wait, I just want to make sure. I want to see if we have any
We've got people.
questions.
We've been
Count me in on tea time. Welcome. It is tea time, and you're hearing. I figured that was a commercial break. Oh, we have all these people.
We forgot to turn the telephone off.
Sorry.
Say a bit more about that. So Trump, there is no intractable regional dispute that President Trump thinks that he can't have a go at resolving. So he's talked a lot about the 8 conflicts that he claims to have resolved. We had a quick look at this earlier.
What were the 8 wars?
Well, I can't remember, but I had to.
Azerbaijan and Armenia, which he said Azerbaijan something, and Albania.
There's a very good Axios, hat tip to Axios. There's a good Axios fact check on this. I think 2 of them have at least come from his first term, and he's identified 6 from the second term, some of which at least he can claim to
Israel, Pakistan.
To India and Pakistan.
I mean, India, Pakistan.
Let's just summarise.
No Israel-Pakistan conflicts. We're not manifesting that.
But some of them he could legitimately claim to have had a hand in bringing to an end. But that's an argument for another day. I think he still has an itch both on Ukraine and Russia, but also on Iran generally. He may be wildly unrealistic about this, but there is no regional conflict that he doesn't feel that he could at least take a hand in resolving.
People, the Iranian American community who voted him in, voted because they thought he was going to be the one who was going to get rid of the regime. But, I had heard before he was elected that he had in 2020, after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commander, that Trump had sent a letter to Khamenei, the Ayatollah supreme leader, saying basically, let's talk. which did not go anywhere for obvious reasons. And, we saw what happened over the summer. But they also could have assassinated the supreme leader, and they didn't. So that does tell you something.
Watch this space, as they say.
Yeah.
Before we move on and close up, we talked a bit about the return of the Israeli hostages. We should acknowledge that in return, Israel has released, I think, over 1,000 people who were detained, at least on suspicion of being involved in Hamas terrorism, and including people who were actually convicted of terrorist murders. And that is a very evocative issue, I think, on both sides. It's clearly sparked scenes of great celebration in the West Bank and in Gaza, but equally it will be a very painful moment for Israelis watching on. We touched on this earlier. It's quite a solemn day of mixed emotions, and that's part of the reason for that.
I mean, quite a few of these hostages died. I think we need to remember that. And at the same time, the Palestinians who have been released were released generally. I mean, they were in prison generally because of horrible things. So of course the Israeli population is going to watch that with fear in a way, because you kind of think, well, what's changed? Who's to say they're not going to turn around and attack us again? And that's really the root of the problem. Is like, how do we make sure this doesn't happen over and over and over again? And the only way to really do that is for the Palestinians to have a sense of autonomy and sovereignty, to no longer be able to say we're occupied by Israel. And because I personally do not see a world in where any of this is going to change without that changing somehow.
And I think fresh leadership, when you and I have talked about this, there is a real sense of, both in Israel and on the Palestinian side, they are crying out for fresh leadership.
Yeah.
And leadership of a new generation who can see a route to a lasting peace. And we were talking a bit about Northern Ireland and the conflict of Northern Ireland. We were talking about this a lot. We went to Northern Ireland a couple of years ago, right? Your first time there. And it really struck me that I thought about this a lot, and that one of the defining differences, I think, between these two conflicts, because when I was a child, even growing up here in the UK in the 1980s, the Northern Ireland conflict was very, very real, and there were bombings in London and terrorist attacks that took people's lives in the mainland, let alone, of course, also in Belfast and the Republic of Ireland. And the difference, it seems to me, was that politicians, a new generation of political leaders came through who were able to see that it was acceptable to make some significant compromises with the aims of achieving peace. And when you go back to Belfast today, you find, an incredibly, it has its tensions still, sure, but it is an incredibly settled, prosperous part of the United Kingdom. And it was that new generation of political leaders coming into power, certainly my experience observing this as a journalist then, that helped to achieve that change. And that doesn't feel like it's present in the Middle East conflict, right, on either side.
I will say that actually Trump did mention, he alluded to that. He mentioned speaking to kind of new people in the Palestinian space and potentially new leadership. He did allude to that, which I kind of immediately thought, ooh, I wonder who that is. Time to get into my journalism mode and find my sources.
Let's just wrap up on the sort of the spectre of the Nobel Peace Prize that's been hanging all over for the last couple of weeks.
Yeah.
We think it's broadly coincidence that this year's Nobel Peace Prize was announced kind of right on the eve of this deal. The Venezuelan winner of this prize herself kind of praised President Trump. Other people, including people close to the Nobel Committee, it seems to me, have been much, much less kind of welcoming of President Trump's chances of taking the Nobel Peace Prize next year. There's a sort of unusual precedent where President Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize very early in his first term, kind of largely on the basis of things he said rather than things he did. And it's kind of hard to argue, whatever you think about President Trump or how we got here, it's hard to argue that this isn't now a substantial track record of, international diplomacy, whatever you think of it.
Yeah.
So looking ahead for another year, I mean, people will say this just doesn't matter. It's all just kind of flim-flam, but it clearly really matters to the president.
Oh,
Right?
he really wants this
Yeah.
Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, to the point where in the Knesset today, it was kind of amusing. Like it came up so many, like everybody mentioned it. Everyone who was speaking pretty much mentioned it. That, you deserve this or you'll get it or this, that, and the other. I mean, are you asking me if I think he deserves it?
I'm not asking you because you're a journalist and you don't have to have a view on this.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw him get it next year. And the fact of the matter is, so because I posted a reel about this and somebody commented and they said, let's remind, the public what the standards are and the qualifications are. And one of them is basically being able to get other countries to work with each other. So that's one of the qualifications. And to be fair to him, that is what's happened. He has gotten countries who normally didn't work together, like Israel and the larger Arab world, to work together. And so, I think particularly if he does end up ending the Ukraine war, then, that's not nothing, particularly because it's not a war that started under his watch, which he likes to remind everyone.
I mean, I think both things are true, right? That if you're the Nobel Committee, I'm sure you could find technical justification in the rules to not award the Nobel Peace Prize to President Trump. Equally, when you look at how, I'm very struck by how kind of NATO leaders and NATO itself has engaged with President Trump, like by flattery. They've just accepted the fact that in order to get America to do what they want it to do, it is just simply necessary to flatter the president. He responds to that.
But is it only
they've
Trump?
that.
But doesn't that always happen? It's just there's such a magnifying glass on Trump because he's Trump and he's just sort of this kind of caricature-like character.
They didn't bother to do it under a Biden presidency, and they didn't need to do it under a Biden presidency because the Biden presidency was less willing to explicitly just use the kind of bully pulpit of American power very nakedly to kind of drive transactional results in international diplomacy. And I think the fact that President Trump is just so brazen about the fact that he just threatens, cajoles, and forces people to come to the table, whether you give him credit or not for the actual outcomes in the end, he is just using naked American power in a way that we haven't seen a president use for certainly many, many generations. And where that leaves the Nobel Committee, well, I'm glad I'm not a call I have to make.
Well, it's actually the Venezuelan woman who won, Maria Corina Machado. I hope I said her name right. Maria Corina Machado.
I wasn't going to attempt it.
Machado.
I'm glad you have.
Machado, yes. I was like, no, I'm messing up a consonant here. It's been controversial to some people, her winning it because of her support for Israel. So basically, the anti-Israel crowd have been up in arms on social media especially, and angry at the Nobel Committee for choosing her because of this, because they say that she's supportive of a genocide. And so I think that's a whole other, next round that we're going to see post the end of the war, the Israel-Hamas war, is because remember, the scholars who determine what is and isn't a genocide did in fact come out and say that what was happening in Gaza was a genocide. So we'll see what happens now.
Okay, my tea's gone cold. So before we turn off, do you think there is any questions coming? We've got a good crowd of people watching, but I don't know if we've got questions. No, we just got lots of friends.
No, we just got comments.
Right.
Thank you for your comments.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for watching.
Send us DMs if we want our Englishman to be a regular contributor on News with Suze. He has been reticent up until now.
Reticent is my middle name.
Yeah, quite. Thank you for joining.